Welcome to a world where crisp autumn air carries more than the scent of fallen leaves. It hides whispers of terror and shadows of the unknown. Tonight we bring you three disturbing true fall horror stories, tales that unravel the eerie underbelly of this picturesque season. As the days grow shorter and the nights stretch longer, these chilling accounts will make you think twice about the comforting glow of a bonfire or the rustle of leaves in the wind. Before we dive in, I want to take a moment to thank you for supporting this channel. Your likes, comments, and shares mean everything to me and keep this community growing stronger. I also wish you and your loved ones good health and happiness as we journey together through these haunting tales. Now grab a warm drink, wrap yourself in a blanket, and prepare for a fall experience unlike any other. Let's begin. Story 1. The Green Mark. It was Bryson's idea, of course. His ideas were always delivered with the kind of unshakable conviction that could make even the bleakest proposition sound irresistible. It's like something out of a dream, he had said, describing the house, a place he'd heard about from a girl in his art class. Our words, filtered through his silver tongue, turned an ordinary gathering into a seductive invitation to the sublime. Upscale, vintage, practically glowing, he'd assured us, each adjective like a breadcrumb leading us deeper into his vision of grandeur. It wasn't difficult to convince us. Bryson's brother, Chris, offered to drive, his usual indifference softening under the promise of a night that might be memorable for once. Ian, ever skeptical but too restless to decline, tagged along. And I, as always, followed out of habit, or perhaps a vague hope that this time, Bryson's world of shimmering adjectives might actually align with reality. We left campus around 10, the car rolling through the town's outskirts, a monotonous sprawl of fast food joints and strip malls. As we drove, the road narrowed, flanked by dense, unyielding trees. The house, when it emerged from the shadows, seemed almost incidental, as though it had grown there rather than been built. It loomed in the moonlight, its large windows catching just enough light to resemble half-lidded eyes, watching us with a quiet, almost indifferent malice. Chris killed the engine, and we stepped out into the cool night air. The house stood silent, its silhouette unnervingly perfect against the backdrop of skeletal trees. Something in me hesitated, a faint but insistent voice whispering that we should turn back. But Bryson, ever the herald of poor decisions, was already moving toward the front door, his stride full of unwarranted confidence. The moment we stepped inside, I knew something was wrong. It wasn't the obvious things, the two bright lights that bleached everything of its color, or the music, a hollow, formless drone that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. It was the silence. Despite the room being crowded, there was none of the clamor you'd expect from a party. Instead, the guests moved and murmured like actors in a play performed for no one. Their eyes, though, those were the worst. They latched onto us the moment we entered, trailing our movements with an intensity that felt less like curiosity and more like dissection. Bryson was unfazed, striding toward the kitchen as if the growing weight of the atmosphere didn't bear down on him. Ian followed, his usual wariness dulled by the lure of unfamiliar faces. I lingered behind, watching as the guests' gazes slid over me like cold, wet hands. By the time I reached the others, Bryson was already laughing, glass in hand, while a tall girl with a fixed, brittle smile poured from a black, unlabeled bottle. Her hand brushed mine as I accepted a glass, and I recoiled instinctively. Her skin was icy, not just cold but lifeless, as though warmth had never been a part of her. She noticed, her expression tightening into a smirk so faint it was almost a reflex. That's when I saw it, the thin green line on her neck, winding from her collarbone to her ear like a vein of poison ivy etched into her skin. I blinked, my gaze shifting to the others around her. One by one, I began to see it, the same green mark, barely visible at first but unmistakable once noticed. They crept over their skin, subtle yet insidious, as if the house itself had branded them. Some wore it openly, a sickly vine curling over their throats, while others concealed it beneath collars and scarves, though not well enough to hide it entirely. A cold, crawling dread settled in my chest. I turned to Bryson and Ian, but they were already too far gone. Their laughter was too loud, their movements too fluid, as though the room's oppressive strangeness had somehow skipped over them. My untouched glass felt heavy in my hand, its contents rippling faintly, though I couldn't tell if it was from my shaking or something else entirely. The room grew warmer, suffocating. The light seemed to pulse, the shadows deepening unnaturally in the corners. I caught myself glancing over my shoulder, certain that something or someone was watching from just beyond the periphery of my vision. Then he appeared. A tall man in a suit that seemed too precise, too immaculate for the occasion. His face was angular, his expression unreadable, save for a faint, almost imperceptible curve at the corner of his mouth. He approached with a slow, deliberate gait, his head tilted just enough to reveal the green mark that spread across his neck like a stain. "What brings you here?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly, as though unused to speech. The question was innocent enough, but the way he said it made me feel as though I'd been caught trespassing in a place I was never meant to see. "I came with friends," I stammered, the words clumsy in my mouth. His eyes narrowed slightly, the curve of his mouth sharpening into something cruel. "Friends," he repeated, as though the word itself was a joke. I turned away, desperate to find Bryson or Ian, to anchor myself in their familiar presence. But when I spotted them, my stomach dropped. The green marks were on them, now thin, winding lines crawling up their necks like parasites that had finally found new hosts. I stumbled backward, my breath quick and shallow as the room seemed to shift and swell around me. The music, that hollow, directionless hum, grew louder, its rhythm syncing with the frantic beating of my heart. I grabbed Bryson's arm, shaking him. His eyes, glassy and unfocused, blinked slowly, as though he were struggling to recognize me. I begged him to leave, my voice trembling with urgency, but he only smiled faintly, a vacant, almost pitying expression that made my skin crawl. The air grew heavier, the walls seeming to close in, and I felt the weight of dozens of eyes boring into me, their stares cold and unfeeling. I don't know how I managed it, but I dragged Bryson and Ian toward the door, their feet shuffling as though they were moving through molasses. Behind us, the tall man's voice echoed faintly, though I couldn't make out the words. The night air hit us like a splash of water, shocking and immediate. We collapsed into Chris's car, and he drove off without a word, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. None of us spoke. Bryson kept touching his neck, his fingers brushing over the place where the mark had been, as though expecting to feel it still there. Ian stared out the window, his face pale and drawn, while Chris glanced at us nervously in the rearview mirror. For a brief moment, I thought we had escaped. But as dawn crept over the horizon, my phone buzzed. A single message waited, its content so simple yet so deeply wrong that it turned my blood to ice. An image of a pale, smiling face, the green mark glistening under the collar, accompanied by a single line of text. "We'll see you again." Story 2 title, I See You. I remember, with a peculiar sense of inevitability, the first time I crossed the threshold of that apartment. There was no sound, not even the creak of the door, as it closed behind me, just the faintest whisper of a draft. It slipped through the cracks of the windows and the peeling walls, as though the building itself was exhaling, surrendering the stale air of its forgotten years. The smell, a blend of decay, ancient dust, and something vaguely metallic greeted me, curling into my lungs. It was the scent of a place long abandoned by both time and memory. But rent was cheap, and the commute manageable. What else did I need, really? The city loomed beyond, its vast, indifferent hum offering no refuge, no escape. I was a grad student, alone and adrift, and this apartment seemed like the only lifeline left in a world that barely noticed me. I paid the deposit, sealed the door, and attempted to convince myself that the place would somehow suffice, that it could be made mine if only for a time. The days that followed were swallowed by the mindless routine of Purdue's civil engineering program. The program demanded, with its grinding precision, every waking moment. I was hollowed out by the hours spent hunched over textbooks, the tedium of lecture halls filled with the clatter of minds too distracted to question the nature of their work. It left me little room for anything else, no space for thoughts beyond the equations, no energy for reflection. Sleep became a brief interruption, a series of fractured moments in a landscape defined by calculations and deadlines. The apartment itself, if one could call it that, was nothing more than a container for this endless monotony. It became a refuge not from the world, but from the weight of its demands. I had no time to observe the strange things that happened there. I barely noticed the cracks in the plaster, or the way the shadows in the corners seemed to shift ever so slightly when I was not looking. There was no room for such concerns. But it was on a Friday evening, after a week spent marred by exhaustion, when the first breach occurred. I had spent the day in the library, clinging to the last of my focus as I lugged my backpack, laden with everything I could not afford to lose: my laptop, my notes, my keys. All of it was packed away, tucked safely inside, but in a moment of carelessness, or perhaps fate's cruel whim, I set the bag down just for a second. I turned away, my mind drifting, and when I looked back, it was gone. The panic was slow, creeping up from some dark recess of my mind, twisting my chest, hollowing me out. I searched, frantic and trembling, through the library's labyrinthine rows of bookshelves, peering under tables, my eyes racing over every surface. Nothing at all. 20 minutes passed, maybe more, and then I abandoned the search, the sense of dread sinking deeper into me. My life was contained in that bag, the fragments of myself, my identity, my existence snatched away, leaving me stripped bare, exposed. That night, I returned to the apartment in a haze, my stomach a pit of unease. The landlord, a man whose face seemed permanently fixed in a scowl, dismissed my request for new locks with an indifference so complete that it bordered on malevolence. "It's a secure building," he grumbled, his voice thick with disdain, as though his words could conjure safety out of thin air. I locked the door behind me, barricading it with furniture and towels stuffed against the gaps. But even as I did so, I could feel the futility of it, the sensation that nothing at all, could protect me. The night that followed was one of restlessness. I lay in bed, the silence pressing against me, and I felt it, the weight of unseen eyes. It was as though the very air around me thickened, the shadows growing deeper, darker. The sensation gnawed at me, a creeping presence that I could not shake, not even in sleep. In the morning, I dismissed it, rationalizing it as the result of my anxiety, the byproduct of the theft and the stress. But then that evening, I found the note. It was slipped under my door, a crumpled sheet of paper, the edges torn unevenly as though it had been hastily discarded. The words scrawled in uneven strokes, like a frenzy stared back at me: "I see you." The message was simple, primal in its brevity, but it hit me with the force of a revelation. I froze, my blood running cold. The words were a puncture into my mind, a jagged incision that made the world outside feel suddenly alien. I knew without a doubt that the one who had taken my bag had found me, that they were here, in this place, watching me, waiting. In the days that followed, nothing more happened, and I began to convince myself that I was being paranoid, that it was simply the aftermath of an unsettling incident. But the dread remained, coiling tighter, and then another note. This one was worse. A cold, detached message: "I know what you did." It was more than a threat, it was an accusation, a distortion of reality. I had done nothing wrong. I had kept to myself, moved through life as a shadow. I was a student, a ghost. And yet here it was, this message, cutting into me, accusing me of some transgression I could not fathom, The ink seemed to writhe on the page as if alive, pulsing with intent. The small disruptions began soon after. At first, it was subtle. My shoes were moved a few inches to the left, my books rearranged, their spines facing outward as if someone had studied them. It was nothing, really, just the randomness of a place left in neglect. But then it grew bolder. The sheets on my bed, which I had left in disarray, were found neatly tucked, as though someone had made the bed in my absence. The kitchen lights, which I never left on, burned bright when I returned. I became obsessed with the idea that someone had my key, that they were slipping in while I was gone, creeping through the apartment with the same dark curiosity that gripped me. Each time I returned, the air felt heavier, more suffocating, as though the walls were closing in, warping. My landlord, of course, refused again to change the locks, his indifference so complete it seemed like a cosmic joke. "It's an old building," he muttered, as though that was explanation enough. I stopped attending classes, retreating into the apartment. The space that had once been a refuge became a prison, the walls pressing in from all sides. I waited obsessively for any sign, any indication of the presence that lurked just beyond my perception. I sat in the dark, listening, straining to hear the faintest sound of footstep, a breath. One night I saw it, a flash of movement, a quick glimmer through the blinds. My heart hammered in my chest, and I rushed to the window, desperate for any evidence that it wasn't my imagination. But there was nothing, only the empty street below, quiet and still, as though mocking my fear. From that moment, every sound, every creak of the building felt like a threat. A presence, something unseen but undeniably there, hovered around me. My mind began to fray at the edges, each day blending into the next. The hours stretched thin by the weight of my dread. The apartment became a stage for my unraveling sanity, the boundaries of reality blurring into something far darker. And then, as if to confirm every fear I had whispered to myself, I returned one evening to find my room destroyed. It was no longer a place I could call my own. Clothes were strewn across the floor, drawers torn open, everything exposed, laid bare in a grotesque parody of invasion. It wasn't a robbery, no, this was something worse. This was violation. This was a taking of something far deeper than mere material possessions. That night I huddled on the couch, every inch of the apartment tainted, twisted into something unrecognizable. The walls closed in around me, the space suffocating, and I wondered, as I lay there trembling, how long it would take before they finally revealed themselves. How long before I would have to face the darkness that had taken root in my life. The last note came in the morning. It was taped to the bathroom mirror, waiting for me when I stumbled in, my body aching from days without rest. "I'm closer than you think." The words were neat, precise, each letter calculated, a message from someone who understood the exact way to carve dread into the soul. I moved like a shadow now, barely present, my mind a blur of numbness and terror. I had no escape. There was nowhere left to run. The apartment had become my cage, its walls pressing in, constricting, until I could no longer tell where the building ended and I began. Every sound, every shadow felt like a step closer to the end. I knew, as surely as I knew my own name, that I was being watched, that I had always been watched. The question was no longer who had been doing this, but why they had chosen me. And in the silence that followed, I realized the answer was something far worse than I could have imagined. Story 3, title Behind the Mask. I had imagined, perhaps too simply, that the dissolution of relationships, those delicate, fragile things, would be akin to the shedding of an old, unworn coat. The kind one pulls from the closet after years of neglect and finds a heaviness, a sickly weight that once seemed to promise comfort but now only clings to the shoulders like some strange mildew. At first the removal is jarring, awkward even yet. It is ultimately liberating. But that was before I understood the nature of the shadows, how they drift and cling, how they whisper in the dark corners of memory. It was the end of my 2-year relationship with Ben, a relationship that had begun with a sweetness that now seems grotesque, like a child's drawing of a smile that turns monstrous under too much scrutiny. No loud arguments, no terrible epiphanies or bitter accusations, only a gradual, silent withering, a fading into something indistinct, like a drawing forgotten in the rain. I blocked his number. I erased his photos. I shoved the remnants of him, those things I had once held dear, into a box in my closet. I thought it was over. I thought I had done enough to bury him, to cast him into the labyrinthine dark where nothing of significance resides. I thought the shadows would claim him as their own, as they claimed so much of what was no longer of use. But shadows move. They are not static. They are never still. I first noticed it on a night that seemed no different from the others. The city, an animal of light and noise, hummed in its usual way. Temple University sits nestled at the heart of this frantic thing, and my apartment, such a small thing, no more than a box in the middle of it all, was not a sanctuary but a mere container for the absurdity outside. Street sounds slithered through the walls, harmless and constant, like the rhythm of a clock that never stops ticking. But this sound was different and irregular, intrusive scrape that didn't belong. I thought it was a cat, perhaps, some creature from the dark streets outside. It must have been a cat. The next night, the noise returned, louder, more insistent. This time, there was no mistaking it. A shuffle, a soft scrape, slow, deliberate against the glass of my window. My heart did a strange flutter, the kind one experiences when they realize they've been watched, but I pulled back the curtain only to find nothing. The street lamps, those terrible sentinels, cast their long shadows across the pavement, motionless, as they always did. I told myself I was imagining things. Paranoia. Too much coffee, not enough sleep. I was fine. I had moved on. But then came the presentation. The room was filled with the ordinary buzz of student life, whispered exchanges. The shuffle of feet, the clink of a coffee cup in the background. My group had prepared for weeks, meticulously crafting slides, perfecting our delivery. A simple task, an ordinary thing, as banal as the rest of it. The projector flickered once, twice, and then the screen filled not with our carefully rehearsed images, but with something else entirely. A figure, distorted and familiar in a way that chilled me to the bone, appeared on the screen. It wore a mask. A scream mask, that grotesque symbol of something desperate and broken. The figure moved with an unnatural precision, each gesture mechanical, like a doll animated by some unseen hand. The images that followed were as grotesque as the figure itself, snapshots of things that no one should ever see, each one framed as if it was meant for me alone, meant to communicate something unspeakable, something hidden just beneath the surface. And that mask, that godforsaken mask, staring directly at me, as though it had always known me, as though it had been watching all along, not at the class, but at me. A sick joke, I told myself. A prank, perhaps, a piece of forgotten internet lore manifesting in the most unfortunate of ways. But the weight of it, the intent behind it, was undeniable. It was too real, too close. All the days that followed blurred together. The sunlight, when it came, seemed to offer no relief. I avoided eye contact with anyone, each glance from my classmates a needle, digging deeper into the flesh of my discomfort. Everywhere I went, the sensation lingered in intrusive awareness, like eyes upon me, invisible yet knowing. My professors were horrified. The university administration, now involved, brought in the police. It wasn't long before they summoned Ben. He appeared before me, as detached and neutral as ever, the quiet ex-lover I had once known. He seemed bewildered, confused even by the entire ordeal. He denied any involvement in the video, but admitted to something I had not expected. Something that felt far more sinister. He had posted my information, my phone number, my social media profiles, fragments of my life on a forum. A place where strangers came together in their anonymity to seek connection of the most perverse, the most reckless kind. I had shut him out, I had erased him, I had buried him, but he had found a way back in. through the back door, with all the subtlety of a predator. In the following days, I began to receive messages. At first, they were blurred photographs, fragmented snapshots of my campus, my daily routines. A building, a hallway, the bench where I sat each day to eat lunch. It was as if someone had been trailing me, observing me in silence. The images arrived quickly, with no discernible pattern, just a steady stream of photographs, each one offering a new perspective, a new angle, a new voyeuristic glimpse into my life. There was an art to them, an obsessive care, a carefully calculated rhythm to the images that was both disturbing and deliberate. I began to feel the presence of the watcher more acutely, as though my every move, my every breath was being counted and catalogued. The shadow grew heavier. The noise outside my window continued, each night growing more pronounced, more confident, as if the entity lurking there was drawing closer. I would sometimes pull back the curtain, only to find nothing. But on rare occasions, I thought I saw something, a shape, a fleeting shadow standing just beyond the reach of the light. And then there was the hand. It came one night, pale and gloved, dragging itself over the glass. It left a streak of oily fingerprints, a mark, a message, a calling card of sorts, something meant to say, I am here, I see you. I tried not to sleep. I tried, but fatigue took over. I would lie there in the dark, the weight of the silence pressing down on me, counting the minutes, waiting for dawn. But when I woke, there was a message waiting for me. A photograph of my front door. The caption, in simple, disquieting handwriting, read, "Tonight." And so I did not leave my apartment. I locked the door, I checked the windows. My hands shook, my heart pounded in my chest, and the night pressed in on me like an invisible weight. The darkness outside seemed to grow more alive, more oppressive with each passing second. I thought of calling the police, but what would I say? There's someone watching me. Who would believe such a thing? Instead, I sat alone, clutching a book for comfort, though I knew it would not help. The clock ticked on, its seconds dragging like an eternity. Midnight passed. 1 a.m. came, then 2. I stayed awake, my mind unraveling slowly in the dark, each minute adding weight to the already suffocating atmosphere. Then came the morning. The first light of dawn filtered through the blinds, soft and pale. For a moment I felt a surge of relief, a fleeting thought that perhaps it had been a nightmare. Perhaps it was all in my head. But when I stood to move, something caught my eye. A slip of paper folded neatly, lying just beneath my door. I reached for it with trembling fingers, knowing somehow that whatever it said would be the end of this fragile hope. I opened the note. The handwriting was familiar, the same looping script as before. It read, simply, "You looked beautiful, watching the sunrise." And that was when I understood. I wasn't safe. Not in my apartment. Not on campus. Nowhere. I was a thing observed. Trapped in a macabre theater where the show was my life and the audience patient, calculating, was waiting. Just waiting. For the moment when I would slip. When I would give them the final invitation. Every day now feels like borrowed time. Every shadow that looms just beyond my vision, every corner I turn, every creak of the floor beneath my feet, it is all a reminder. A countdown. And I know, as I sit here now, that I am never truly alone. They are watching, always. Just waiting for the moment to strike again. As we reach the end of tonight's exploration into the eerie unknown, these 3 disturbing true fall horror stories have reminded us of something profoundly unsettling. Even the most comforting seasons can harbor dark and chilling secrets. Fall, with its breathtaking scenery of fiery leaves, the smell of pumpkin spice, and the gentle crackle of bonfires, often feels like a time of celebration and calm. But in its quiet beauty, there's an unmistakable stillness that can make the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. It's a season where the line between the natural and the supernatural seems to blur, where every rustling leaf, shadowy path, and unexplained sound could be hiding a deeper, darker truth. These stories remind us to always be vigilant. What begins as an ordinary moment, a walk through the woods, a visit to a familiar place, or simply a quiet night at home, can shift into something far more sinister. The unexplained has a way of finding us, even when we think we're safe. Perhaps it's the very stillness of fall that makes it the perfect time for the unknown to creep into our lives, unnoticed until it's too late. I want to take a moment to thank each and every one of you for being here and supporting this channel. Your time, your likes, your comments, and the way you share these videos mean everything. Together, we've created a community where we can explore these strange, often terrifying stories and feel a little less alone in facing the mysteries of the world. It's your passion and curiosity that keep this channel alive, and I am endlessly grateful for your support. As the days grow colder and the nights stretch longer, I wish you warmth, safety, and peace. Keep your loved ones close, your lights on, and always trust your instincts, because sometimes the things we dismiss as coincidences or imagination are the very things we should fear the most. Until we meet again in the next video, take care of yourselves, stay curious, and remember that the truth, however disturbing, is always worth uncovering. Thank you, stay safe, and I'll see you soon for another journey into the unknown.